Have you ever wondered what lies beneath the endless white desert at the bottom of our planet? A place larger than Europe, colder than Mars, and more mysterious than the deepest ocean trench. A land so hostile that no permanent human settlement has ever survived there, and yet, nearly every superpower on Earth is quietly circling it like predators around a wounded animal. Why? Because Antarctica is not just a frozen wasteland, it may very well be the most valuable piece of land left on Earth. And as the ice begins to melt, the race to own it is already underway. This is World's Echoes, and before we dive deeper into one of the greatest geopolitical stories of our time, don't forget to subscribe and join us, because here we uncover the hidden battles shaping our world. Now imagine this: Antarctica, the coldest, driest, and most extreme continent on Earth, has no native human population, no cities, no nations, and no governments. It is the last untouched frontier on our planet. And yet, every year, more countries send scientists, researchers, and sometimes even military-linked personnel to build bases there. The official explanation? Science. The unofficial one? A fight over resources, power, and influence that could shape the next century. To understand why Antarctica has become the center of a silent global contest, we first need to travel back in time, to when humans barely knew this continent even existed. For centuries, maps showed the fabled Terra Australis Incognita, Latin for unknown southern land. It was more of a myth than a reality. Ancient philosophers believed there must be a massive landmass in the south to balance the continents in the north. Explorers sailed into stormy southern waters chasing this ghostly continent, often never to return. But eventually, myth gave way to discovery. The first confirmed sighting of Antarctica came in 1820, when Russian explorers Fabian von Bellingshausen and Mikhail Lazarev spotted the frozen coast. Almost simultaneously, British and American expeditions reported similar sightings. But what they saw wasn't a land ready for colonization. It was a nightmare of ice cliffs, howling winds, and temperatures that could kill a man in minutes. For most of the 19th century, Antarctica remained untouched, visited only by whalers and sealers who hunted in the surrounding seas. But then came the era of exploration. In the early 20th century, Antarctica became the stage for one of the greatest dramas in human history, the race to the South Pole. Brave, or some might say reckless, explorers like Roald Amundsen, Robert Falcon Scott, and Ernest Shackleton risked everything to conquer the frozen continent. Amundsen succeeded, Scott perished, Shackleton barely survived. These stories of courage and tragedy captured the imagination of the world, but behind them, something else was brewing. Nations were beginning to stake claims. Britain, Norway, France, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and Argentina all began drawing lines on maps, claiming slices of the icy pie. But here was the problem: unlike Africa or the Americas, Antarctica was not a land of tribes or kingdoms to conquer. It was an empty, frozen wilderness, larger than any empire, where survival itself was nearly impossible. Planting a flag there meant little. But nations kept trying, because deep down, they suspected Antarctica might one day become more than just ice. By the time World War II ended, the game had changed. Technology had advanced, aerial surveys revealed mountain ranges and massive ice shelves, and whispers began spreading that beneath the ice, there could be vast reserves of coal, oil, and minerals. Suddenly, Antarctica wasn't just a frozen curiosity. It was a potential treasure chest. And in the early days of the Cold War, with the United States and the Soviet Union locked in a battle for global supremacy, even this frozen continent became a strategic prize. It was during this period that one of the most mysterious events in Antarctic history took place: Operation High Jump. In 1946, just after World War II, the United States sent the largest expedition ever to Antarctica, over 4,000 men, 13 ships, and dozens of aircraft. Officially, it was for training and scientific exploration. Unofficially, rumors swirled that it was a military operation to secure America's interests in Antarctica before the Soviets could. The truth remains debated to this day, but one thing was clear: Antarctica was no longer just about penguins and glaciers. It had entered the world of geopolitics. As the 1950s rolled on, tensions grew. Nations built research stations, mapped coastlines, and tested their endurance in the brutal climate. Argentina and Chile even sent families to live there temporarily, hoping to prove their claims. But the world was on the edge of disaster. Nuclear weapons were spreading, the Cold War was heating up, and the last thing humanity needed was another continent to fight over. And so, in 1959, something extraordinary happened. For the first time in history, 12 nations, including the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and others, signed the Antarctic Treaty. This remarkable document declared that Antarctica would belong to no one. It would be used only for peaceful purposes, and all military activity was banned. Nuclear explosions and radioactive waste? Forbidden. Territorial claims? Frozen. Scientific research? Encouraged. For a moment, it seemed like humanity had done the impossible. We had set aside our rivalries and preserved an entire continent for peace and science. But here's the catch. The treaty didn't erase the claims, it merely suspended them. The British still claimed a huge portion, overlapping with Argentina and Chile. Australia claimed nearly half the continent. Norway carved out a section. The United States and Russia, interestingly, claimed nothing yet carefully reserved the right to do so in the future. In other words, the treaty was a ceasefire, not a permanent solution. And as decades passed, cracks began to appear. For while the world celebrated Antarctica as a land of peace, the superpowers quietly kept one eye on it. They built more research stations, sometimes suspiciously close to strategic locations. They tested satellites and radar systems using the continent's unique position at the bottom of the globe. And they never stopped thinking about the resources buried under the ice. Think about this, Antarctica holds about 70% of the world's fresh water, locked in ice sheets up to 4 kilometers thick. If even a fraction of that melts, global sea levels would rise dramatically, flooding cities from New York to Shanghai. Beneath the ice, geologists believe there could be massive reserves of coal, oil, natural gas, and rare minerals essential for modern technology. And unlike the Arctic, which is already divided between nations, Antarctica remains unowned. It is, quite literally, the last great prize. So while the treaty still holds, the quiet race never stopped. And as climate change accelerates, as ice sheets retreat, and as new technology makes resource extraction more possible, the question grows louder: when the ice melts, who will own Antarctica? The answer is far from simple. In the next part of this story, we'll see how the Cold War, hidden military interests, and the greed for resources turned Antarctica into a silent battlefield. Because the fight for the frozen continent never truly ended, it merely went underground. When the Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1959, the world breathed a sigh of relief. For the first time, rival nations agreed that an entire continent would remain free of war, weapons, and conquest. On the surface, it looked like a triumph of peace over politics. But the truth, as always, was more complicated. Because the treaty did not erase the ambitions of nations, it simply delayed them. Behind the scenes, the Cold War was raging. The United States and the Soviet Union were competing on every front: space, nuclear weapons, influence in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Did anyone really believe they would simply ignore Antarctica? Of course not. Instead, both sides began to use the loopholes in the treaty. Research stations allowed under the agreement suddenly multiplied. Officially, they were for science. Unofficially, they became tools of strategy. Take McMurdo Station, for example, the massive American base built on Ross Island. It wasn't just a cluster of laboratories, it was a small town, complete with runways that could land heavy military aircraft. From there, the US could monitor the southern skies, test communication satellites, and even train in extreme conditions that might one day resemble combat on another planet. The Soviet Union responded with their own network of stations, like Vostok, built deep inland near the magnetic South Pole. Its location was perfect for studying the ionosphere, but it also allowed Moscow to test long-range communication systems that had obvious military applications. And then there was Operation Deep Freeze. Launched by the United States in 1955, it was the logistical backbone of American presence in Antarctica. Every year, fleets of military aircraft and ships delivered supplies, fuel, and personnel. The official explanation was that the military was simply providing transport for scientists. But the sheer scale of these operations made it clear, the US military was not about to let go of Antarctica. The Soviets, of course, watched closely. Both sides suspected the other of using science as a cover for intelligence work. Radar installations, weather studies, satellite tracking, all of these had dual uses. In fact, some historians argue that Antarctica became a silent theater of the Cold War, not with tanks or missiles, but with research stations that doubled as listening posts. But why go to all this trouble for a frozen wasteland? Because beneath the ice, there were whispers of treasure. In 1957, geologists drilling near the Transantarctic Mountains found coal seams, proof that Antarctica was not always a frozen desert but once a lush, green continent filled with life. Later surveys suggested the presence of oil and natural gas reserves offshore. And in the decades that followed, evidence grew that beneath the thick ice sheets lay valuable minerals, iron ore, copper, gold, even rare earth elements essential for modern electronics. Now imagine this from the perspective of the Cold War superpowers. The world was hungry for resources. Oil-fueled economies. Rare minerals were critical for weapons and technology. Whoever could unlock Antarctica's riches might gain a massive advantage. But there was a problem: the Antarctic Treaty specifically banned mining and resource extraction. So officially, no one touched the ice. But unofficially, surveys continued, quietly mapping what lay beneath. And Antarctica held another secret that made it even more valuable: water. Not just a little, but the majority of the planet's freshwater supply. Locked in glaciers miles thick, Antarctica's ice represented the largest reservoir of drinkable water on Earth. At a time when deserts were spreading, populations were booming, and water scarcity was becoming a global crisis, this fact did not go unnoticed. Some even began to speculate about the future possibility of towing giant icebergs north to supply thirsty cities. It sounded like science fiction, but in a world desperate for resources, science fiction has a way of becoming reality. The Cold War also introduced a new dimension to Antarctica: secrecy and suspicion. Take the mysterious story of Nazi Germany's expedition to Antarctica in 1938, just before the outbreak of World War II. The Germans sent a ship, the Schwabenland, to claim territory they called New Schwabenland. They mapped large areas and allegedly marked the land with swastikas. After the war, rumors exploded: had the Nazis built secret bases in Antarctica? Had they hidden technology there? The lack of evidence only fueled conspiracy theories, especially when the US launched the massive Operation High Jump soon after the war. To some, it looked like America was making sure the Nazis, or anyone else, did not control the frozen continent. Most historians dismiss these stories as exaggerations, but they highlight an important truth: Antarctica has always attracted secrecy, suspicion, and speculation. And in the Cold War era, secrecy was the norm. The Soviets guarded their activities closely. The Americans did the same. What exactly was being studied, monitored, or tested was not always clear. And that mystery added to the continent's aura of danger and intrigue. Meanwhile, other nations refused to be left out. Argentina and Chile continued to reinforce their overlapping claims, sometimes even flying military patrols. Britain clashed diplomatically with them over these territories, leading to tense standoffs. At one point, Argentina went so far as to send a pregnant woman to its base, ensuring that the first child ever born in Antarctica was an Argentine citizen, symbolically claiming the land as their own. Australia, too, quietly expanded its influence, claiming nearly half the continent as the Australian Antarctic Territory. Norway held onto its slice, known as Queen Maud Land. France, New Zealand, and others maintained smaller claims. By the 1970s, it looked as though Antarctica had become a patchwork quilt of competing ambitions, except for the giant blank spaces reserved by the United States and the Soviet Union, both of whom cleverly avoided making formal claims but reserved the right to do so later. And while the treaty prohibited resource exploitation, technology was advancing. By the late 20th century, new seismic surveys, satellite imaging, and drilling techniques were revealing more and more about what lay beneath Antarctica's icy crust. Scientists estimated that vast reserves of oil and natural gas might lie under the Ross Sea and the Weddell Sea. Coal seams stretched hundreds of kilometers. And most tantalizing of all, geologists discovered evidence of rare minerals, platinum, chromium, even diamonds hidden deep in the mountains and under the ice sheets. For the superpowers, this knowledge was like a locked vault filled with gold. They couldn't open it yet, but they could make sure no one else did either. And so, the Antarctic Treaty, while still intact, became a fragile shield, protecting the continent from open exploitation while concealing the ambitions simmering beneath. By the 1980s, these tensions came to a head. Several nations pushed to open up Antarctica for resource exploitation. Talks were held, and a draft agreement called the Minerals Convention was proposed, which would have allowed regulated mining. But then came a shock. Environmental groups around the world erupted in protest. They argued that opening Antarctica to mining would destroy one of the last pristine ecosystems on Earth. The pressure was immense, and eventually, in 1991, the Madrid Protocol was signed. It banned all mineral resource activities in Antarctica indefinitely, except for scientific research. For the time being, the ice would remain untouched. But once again, the story did not end there. Because indefinitely does not mean forever. The protocol can be reviewed after 2048, just over 2 decades from now. And already, nations are preparing. Bases are being expanded. Icebreakers and polar ships are being built. Satellite monitoring of the continent is increasing. The moment the door opens, the race will begin again, only this time, with far higher stakes. Think about it, by 2048, the world's population will be approaching 10 billion. Resources like oil, gas, and water will be under unprecedented pressure. Climate change will have melted parts of Antarctica, making access easier than ever. And the technology to mine, drill, and transport across the ice will be vastly more advanced. Which superpower will resist the temptation to claim its share? The United States? China? Russia? Europe? Or will a new coalition of nations rise to challenge them all? The frozen continent may look empty now, but it is, in reality, a giant chessboard where the pieces are quietly being moved into position. And in our next part, we'll see how melting ice, climate change, and new shipping routes are turning Antarctica into one of the most critical battlegrounds of the 21st century. Because the fight for Antarctica is not about the distant future, it's already begun. Picture this, a continent that for millions of years has been locked in ice, suddenly beginning to awaken. Towering glaciers, once thought to be immovable, are breaking apart like fragile glass. Vast ice shelves, bigger than entire countries, are collapsing into the ocean. And deep beneath the frozen surface, rivers and lakes are stirring, hidden worlds untouched since the age of the dinosaurs. This is not science fiction. This is Antarctica today. Climate change is transforming the last great wilderness on Earth, and in the process, it is igniting a global race for power and control unlike anything we have ever seen. Because as the ice melts, Antarctica is no longer just a frozen desert. It is becoming accessible, exploitable, and dangerously valuable. Let's start with the ice itself. Antarctica holds nearly 70% of the world's freshwater, frozen in ice sheets up to 4 kilometers thick. The West Antarctic ice sheet, in particular, is unstable. Scientists call its weakest link the Doomsday Glacier, Thwaites Glacier. If it collapses, it could trigger a chain reaction that raises global sea levels by more than 3 meters. Imagine the devastation: New York, London, Shanghai, Mumbai, all partly underwater. Entire nations swallowed by the sea. Billions displaced. It's not a distant apocalypse, it could happen within the next century. But here's the paradox. The very same melting that threatens the world also makes Antarctica more tempting to superpowers. As the ice recedes, resources that were once locked away become reachable. Offshore oil and gas fields, rare earth minerals, coal, even diamonds, suddenly they're not just hidden beneath kilometers of ice, but exposed or within drilling range. It's as if nature itself is opening a vault humanity was never meant to touch. And it's not just what lies beneath the ground. Melting ice is transforming the oceans around Antarctica, creating new shipping routes that could redefine global trade. For centuries, the Southern Ocean was an impassable barrier, filled with icebergs and storms. But as the ice retreats, new passages are emerging. Imagine supertankers cutting directly across the southern hemisphere, bypassing the Panama Canal or Cape Horn. The time saved, the fuel saved, the profits gained, it's enormous. And whoever controls these new routes could dominate global trade in ways we can barely imagine. It's no wonder, then, that countries are already positioning themselves for the future. China, for instance, has rapidly expanded its presence in Antarctica. It now operates multiple research stations, an advanced icebreaker fleet, and even a satellite monitoring system dedicated to polar observation. Officially, it's all about science. Unofficially, China's ambitions are clear. It wants a seat at the table when the future of Antarctica is decided. Russia, too, is flexing its muscles. Its Antarctic stations are strategically located, and its icebreaker fleet, the largest in the world, gives it unmatched access to polar waters. Russian scientists have drilled deep into Lake Vostok, a subglacial lake sealed off from the surface for millions of years. Officially, the goal is pure science. But many suspect the data also has potential applications for resource exploration and even astrobiology, since studying life in such extreme conditions could help in the search for life on other planets. The United States, for its part, has never claimed territory in Antarctica, but it maintains some of the largest and most advanced stations, like McMurdo and Amundsen Scott South Pole Station. These bases are not just centers of research, they're symbols of influence. They remind the world that when the time comes to decide Antarctica's fate, America will not be left out. Europe, too, has a stake. Nations like Britain, France, Germany, and Norway continue to operate research stations and invest heavily in polar science. Australia and New Zealand, both geographically close to Antarctica, maintain strong territorial claims and are quietly upgrading their polar capabilities. Even smaller nations, from India to South Korea, are building Antarctic programs not because they expect to dominate, but because they know the future of the continent will affect everyone. But perhaps the most shocking development is the quiet militarization of Antarctica. Officially, the Antarctic Treaty bans all military activity. But what exactly counts as military? Some nations have begun to blur the line. Icebreakers, for example, are technically civilian, but they are often built to military specifications. Satellite monitoring, supposedly for climate research, can also track ships and aircraft. Research stations, while scientific on paper, are often equipped with advanced communications systems that could serve military purposes. It's a shadow game. No one openly admits to violating the treaty, but everyone is preparing for the day when the rules change. And the more the ice melts, the more inevitable that day seems. Now let's pause here for a moment, because this is where I want to hear from you, the audience. Do you think Antarctica should remain a place of peace and science forever, protected from human greed? Or do you believe it's inevitable that nations will exploit its resources once the ice retreats? Let me know what you think in the comments, I'll be reading them. Because this question gets to the heart of the Antarctic dilemma. On one hand, Antarctica represents hope, a continent untouched by war, preserved for humanity as a symbol of cooperation. On the other, it represents temptation, an unclaimed treasure chest in a world where resources are running out and competition is fierce. And make no mistake, the temptation is growing. Satellite surveys have already detected massive oil and gas deposits beneath the Southern Ocean. Rare earth elements, essential for smartphones, electric cars, and advanced weaponry, may be hidden in Antarctica's mountains. Freshwater reserves, more valuable than gold in a warming world, could one day be tapped. Some experts believe Antarctica may hold the largest untapped resource reserves on Earth. And in a time when energy, technology, and water shortages could spark global conflict, that makes the frozen continent the most important piece of land humanity has not yet divided. Add to this the strategic location. Antarctica sits at the bottom of the globe, a perfect vantage point for satellite tracking, missile detection, and even future space operations. Control over Antarctica could mean control over the skies and seas of the southern hemisphere. It's not just about resources, it's about power. And this is why nations are quietly fortifying their presence. Bases are being modernized. Icebreakers are being built. Satellite systems are expanding. All under the cover of science, but with eyes fixed firmly on the future. The melting ice is accelerating this race. Every year, glaciers retreat farther. Every year, the Southern Ocean opens wider. What was once unreachable is becoming accessible. And as the clock ticks toward 2048, the year the mining ban in the Madrid Protocol can be reviewed, the pressure is mounting. The treaty may hold for now, but history tells us treaties are only as strong as the interests they protect. And when the prize is this great, how long can it really last? In the final, we'll venture into the conspiracies, the hidden projects, and the current tensions that suggest the race for Antarctica has already begun in secret. And we'll ask the chilling question, when the ice finally gives way, will the world cooperate, or will we fight over the last unclaimed continent? So here we are, standing at the edge of the world, staring into a future that feels like a ticking clock. Antarctica is no longer just a frozen desert at the bottom of the map, it's becoming a stage where the greatest powers on Earth are preparing for a showdown that could shape the next century. The ice, the oceans, the minerals, the hidden treasures beneath the snow, even the very control of climate itself, these are the prizes that make Antarctica one of the most valuable and dangerous frontiers of our time. The truth is, this continent holds enough fresh water to raise sea levels around the world by over 60 meters if the ice melts completely. Imagine that for a second, coastal cities like New York, London, Karachi, Mumbai, and Shanghai swallowed by the ocean. Hundreds of millions of people displaced, trillions of dollars of damage, nations collapsing under the weight of migration and loss. And that's not science fiction, it's the kind of real-world crisis scientists are warning about if the Antarctic ice continues to retreat. The countries fighting to secure influence here aren't just after resources. They know whoever controls Antarctica's fate may also control humanity's survival. But then, there's the shadowy side, the conspiracies, the secrets, the whispers that Antarctica hides more than just ice and rock. For decades, rumors have swirled about strange structures buried beneath the snow, massive tunnels, and even ancient remains that defy human history. Most of it is speculation, but isn't it curious how restricted and tightly controlled information about Antarctica really is? Almost no one is allowed past the borders of the research stations. Flights are limited. Access is policed under the strictest terms. Why is it so hidden? Maybe it's just logistics, or maybe the world's powers know that whoever unlocks Antarctica's deepest secrets will hold knowledge and possibly technologies that could change civilization forever. And yet, through all the greed, the fear, the secrecy, there's still awe. This is a land where the sun can stay above the horizon for months and then vanish for months more. A land where the air feels sharp enough to cut, where the silence is so complete it's almost deafening. A place that humbles even the most powerful leaders and billionaires because here, at the bottom of the earth, nature is still king. The ice, the storms, the bitter cold, it doesn't care who you are, what weapons you hold, or how much money you have. Antarctica is bigger, stronger, and older than us all. So the race continues. Nations plan, ships sail, satellites watch, and deals are made in silence behind closed doors. The Antarctic Treaty holds, for now. But it was only signed for 50 years before review, and whispers of renegotiation are already in the air. What happens when the ice becomes too valuable, when energy becomes too scarce, when food becomes too hard to grow elsewhere? Will the treaty shatter? Will countries send armies to the ice? Will Antarctica become the last battlefield of Earth? Or could it become something else entirely, a chance for humanity to prove that we can share, that we can protect, that we can look beyond war and greed, and instead unite over one of the last truly untouched places left on our planet? That is the question history hasn't answered yet. But one thing is certain, the story of Antarctica is only just beginning. And the choices we make in the next few decades will decide whether this frozen land becomes a symbol of hope, or of humanity's final downfall. Thank you for watching World's Echoes, where we uncover the hidden struggles, secrets, and wonders of our planet. If this journey through the race for Antarctica left you with chills, then help us reach even more curious minds by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and subscribing for more deep dives into the mysteries of our world. Because the echoes of today's choices will shape tomorrow's world. And together, we can make sure those echoes are worth remembering.